Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Sweezy, Associate Director. Associate Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge. We're happy to have you here with us this evening. We're here tonight to discuss Michael McCarthy's new book, Master's Tools: How Finance Direct Democracy in a Radical Humanitarian Movement. It's already received a lot of praise on the back of the book. Several quotes, but there's one by Dismantling Solidarity that I think is a good one. Wing says Michael McCarthy is a real one. He pitches democracy as a system of many publics, nested spaces of distributed ownership and decision-making, drawing on collective intelligence. It's not just a critique, it's a book. To purchase a copy of this book after this event. I want to also thank the Remarque Institute for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Let me briefly introduce both Michael and Shahin, and then Michael will give a full presentation. Shahin will comment on the book, and then we'll make sure to carve out at least 30 minutes or so for a Q&A before we wrap up at 7 o'clock. Michael McCarthy is Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of Community Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research is on class, capitalism, and democracy. His first book, Dismantling Solidarity, Capitalist Politics and American Pensions, was published with Cornell University Press back in 2017 and was awarded the Paul Sweezy Book Award. In addition to academic publishing, his work has been featured in outlets such as the Boston Review, Guardian, Hammer & Hope, Jacobin, New York Times, New Left Review, and Washington Post. And here to be a part of tonight's discussion, we're honored to have Shahin Vallée. He's the head of DGAP's Geoeconomics program. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow in DGAP's Oppenheim Center for European Policy Studies. Until June 2018, Vallée was a senior economist for Soros Fund Management and worked on a wide range of political and economic issues. He also served as a personal advisor to George Soros. Prior to that, he was the economic advisor to Emmanuel Macron, the French Ministry of Economic and Finance, who focused on European economic issues. Between 2012 and 2014, Vallée was an economic advisor to President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, and this experience has put him at the heart of European economic policy discussions since 2012. Vallée is currently completing a PhD in political economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and is currently a fellow at the Remarque Institute. And we're so happy to have Shahin here tonight, here as part of NYU this year, and Mike, the imaginary Mike, Remarque.
Thanks, Mike, for having me. Mike before was telling me that Mom Donnie was here a few years ago. How long ago?
14 months ago.
14 months ago, and only had an audience of 9, so I'm meeting Mom Donnie, which I would never want to do, actually. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you to Shahin for reading my book and comments. I'm going to try to just give a little bit of an overview of the book. Try to keep it simple so we can dive into the discussion. When I was a grad student at NYU, I went here. It's around the time that Occupy Wall Street kind of kicked off. It was really kind of one of these really important political moments for me. I found myself down there quite often. And at the time, the issues that were being raised and the kinds of demands that were being put out there were really what I would think of as a more defensive form of activism. It was an activism against the way in which regulations had kind of fallen apart, and Wall Street excesses had kind of gone out of control. It was an activism against the widening of inequality. But if you look at the financial activism now, it's much more what I would think of as emancipatory activism. Things like Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, or Public Bank LA in Los Angeles, or a whole host of different kind of think tanks and organizations. Activists and folks kind of thinking about the ills of finance today are really thinking about how to create new institutions with new kinds of ethos that drive them. And for me, all of these things are really centering the issue of democracy. And so what I want to kind of do today, and what I did in the talk, is really try to think through this this new moment that we're in terms of thinking about alternatives, and to think about the ways in which democracy and finance are deeply intertwined with each other. The talk is basically going to have 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to try to lay out why finance is actually a democracy problem, and why the lack of democracy in finance has led to deep underinvestment into the things that we need. In the second part, I'm going to talk about why finance itself wrecks democracy, formal democratic institutions. And there my argument is going to be about the particular types of power that financial actors have. And I'm going to call it asset power. And then in the final part, which is I think maybe the most hopeful part, I'm going to talk about some design principles as well as an idea for how to democratize finance. So if you want to think about it like this, the first 2/3 of the talk are depressing, and the last third is like positive, ending, you know, where can we go from here? All right, so why finance is a democracy problem? Well, this is kind of the standard story of financialization, right? You have the rise of finance, insurance, real estate, essentially as a percentage of gross value added, and you see a decline in manufacturing. And this is basically a story that we see across financialized economies. So this is the U.S., but you see something very similar in the U.K. And typically, when people talk about finance, they center this. As important for me, if not more important, is the way that as financialization has developed, people's wealth and their own savings and their own economic values are tied up into financial markets. So what this basically shows us is looking at the wealth of different income groups and how much of that wealth is tied up into stocks. And we of course know that the elite hold a very large percentage of their wealth in financial markets, and that's what this. You see that? Yeah. This is what the top 1% of income groups is here. So we see that between 1989 and 2019, that top 1% had a 59% increase in the amount of wealth that they had tied up in financial assets. That story is typically left off there, right? But we see that mirrored in some important ways for working class people as well. So here we have the bottom 50% of income earners in the US, and we saw a 30% increase between 1989 and 2019 in financial markets. This is their wealth. Now most of their wealth is held in homes, but nonetheless, ordinary working people are in their own wealth through pension funds, through mutual funds, through a whole host of different types of investment vehicles, are tied into financial markets. This is really fundamentally important for me because I think that it helps us explain how capitalism has transformed in key ways. And for me, one of the key institutional developments that has come out of this is the growth of massive asset managers. In my book on Dismantling Solidarity, I call this workers' capital. But in other books that have come out more recently, like Brent Christopher's book, it's been called things like Asset Manager Society. And basically you have these very large asset managers that manage things like pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds. They include private equity firms. And they're playing this really large, outsized role in some ways in total investment decisions over people's savings, right? The issue with this is that these asset managers, because of fiduciary duty, because of basically very elaborate legal constraints, are driven by the single objective, which is to maximize the returns on the investments, right? And so the way in which these asset managers have gone about investing, this differs in different times, different moments as trends come and go, is basically to acquire financial assets and to extract as much value that they can possibly get out of them in the shortest amount of time. This might sound good, right? If you're a beneficiary, you want to get the most you can possibly get out of your pension savings. You want to get the most out of as you can possibly get out of your mutual funds. But it's led to a kind of siphoning off of investments into these markets that are purely extractive. And it's led to essentially an underinvestment in socially needed goods and services, an underinvestment into community wealth building, an underinvestment into the green technology retrofits, an underinvestment into affordable housing. And the simple issue for that is because it's just quite simply not as profitable to invest this money in those things as it would be to invest in different types of financial assets. That's what we basically find across the board. And so it would make no sense for an asset manager to do that if they're driven by what? The maximizing profit. So why is this a democracy problem? The way in which our current American capitalism works with these massive titanic asset managers is that they're governed, right, solely for the purpose of maximizing returns. But there's no way that you can actually incorporate into those decisions the social values that the beneficiaries might actually have with regard to the investment of their own money, right? There's no way to have voice in those places, right? There's no way in which people can say, actually, we would prefer to take a slight loss if it means that we're not investing in things that are destroying the environment, or we're investing in things that might actually create more housing. So we have a democracy problem. Finance isn't just a democracy problem in the sense of these asset managers don't provide deliberative space for ordinary people. In the direct sense, the people who are the direct beneficiaries of them, to influence them. It's also a democracy problem in the sense that as finance has grown, as these asset managers have become more predominant in our society, formal political institutions have been eroded by them as well. Formal democracy has been eroded. In the book, basically, I talk about 3 different forms of leverage that finance has in democratic politics. And I call these engagement, entanglement, and prominence. And I argue that these are undergirded by something that I call asset power, which I'll kind of get to in the end. But I'll kind of walk through these in a brief way, just to kind of give a sense of what I'm getting at. Engagement is kind of the normal way in which we think about influencing politics on behalf of the elite, right? It's direct organizing in politics. It's interlocking directorates. It's business associations. It's spending on lobbying and campaign contributions. And the financial sector is massively involved in organizing in politics. It's one of the largest campaign spenders, one of the most significant lobbyists. It's hugely organized in terms of business associations and its role in interlocking directorates, basically corporate boards. Go to any small, mid-sized university in the Midwest and look at the board of trustees, and you'll find that at least half come from finance. So it's actively engaged in sort of using these networks to actually influence political actors, to shape the outcomes of politics, to shape the outcomes of important political decisions. A second is somewhat more complex, but it's something that I call entanglement. And this is the way that the financial system is actually embedded in non-financial firms and also in the state. So think about, the last time you were probably on a plane, you kind of had that experience where the stewardess towards the end of the flight offered you a credit card, you get 40,000 miles for free or something like that if you signed up. That's because airlines like United or Delta increasingly get a source of their profit from financial activities, right? Not just credit cards, but other types of financial activities as well. Or think about the ways that if you look at firms in the U.S., the small firms to the medium-sized firms, they're incredibly indebted right now. They're under huge amounts of debt. They're dependent on those flows of debt from financial actors in order to stay afloat, in order to kind of finance their own operations. So it's in this way that actually the financial sector is not this separate thing that's over there, and then you have non-financial firms over here. It's actually deeply intertwined with non-financial firms. It's so much so that like non-financial firms have become dependent on finance for their own profits in key ways. And we have some indicators that suggest why this, not why, but that suggest this is the case. If you look at lobbying attempts, so imagine you have a bill that comes before Congress, right? It's a bill that's going to regulate business. No sector of business gets more support from other sectors of business in lobbying against regulations on it than the financial sector. So if a financial regulation comes down in front of Congress, you'll get lobbying from agriculture, you get lobbying from manufacturing, you'll be getting lobbying from non-financial firms against those regulatory changes, which suggests in some ways that this kind of entanglement has made the financial sector something of a hegemonic sector. The last I call prominence, and this is the idea that because the financial sector has become so large, these large asset managers who are managing huge pools of assets, because so many people are in some ways dependent on them for their own savings, and even if it's something that seems like a small amount, right? Maybe somebody has a couple $1,000s in a mutual fund. That shapes how their perception of their own well-being is shaped by that ownership, right? And so it creates a situation whereby the simple size of finance in the economy, the fact that so many people are tied up into it, makes it so politicians themselves see the interests of finance as in the interests of everybody, right? And without lobbying, without sort of the entanglements, politicians are not going to try to do things that undermine the stock market, because they'll see that in some fundamental way as a threat to their own jobs in terms of the next election. So we have these three basic ways that finance kind of undermines democratic politics, and I go into them in a lot more detail in the book. But each of these kind of leverages is activated and kind of made salient by the particular kind of asset that financial actors hold. They hold financial assets. And financial assets are much different than agricultural assets or industrial assets, right? It's a field of broccoli is a lot different than a portfolio full of stocks, right? A field of broccoli, you have to wait until it grows, then you sell it. There's certain sort of natural time dimension to it. A factory full of machines, you can't simply sell it. You have to like move it. It has a huge amount of cost. Financial assets, unlike most other capital assets, are highly mobile, meaning that you can quickly move financial assets from one holder to another with very little cost. And they're highly liquid, which means that you can quickly sell it. You can with a stroke of with a keystroke essentially, you could liquidate your holdings and you'll get cash out of it, which is much different than other forms of assets like agriculture, where you have to wait until it grows and all that. This character of financial assets actually informs the way that financial actors themselves shape politics. So when finance is lobbying the state, it's threatening to quickly move investments out of certain areas. When finance is influencing non-financial firms, it's threatening that it's gonna withdraw debt. Right? This kind of liquidity of this ability to move money around becomes an important source of power for finance. But it's also an important source of contention. As finance capitalism has developed, you'll notice increasingly that activism has kind of honed in on large pools of finance as being sort of a source of power. So I was at this is a picture I took. It was a conference on economic planning at the University of Chicago, and in the middle of a talk, there was like a crash, and I go outside, and like this is immediately like what I see, and basically the building right next door to us is a center that's run by David Axelrod, and it is being occupied. This is the moment of occupation. Right? It's being occupied by a group of student protesters who are basically making demands at the University of Chicago redirect its endowment away from firms and stocks that are benefiting from the war in Gaza. Right? They understood that this pool of finance is actually a political has important political dimensions, and it's become a kind of object of contestation. And you'll see this more and more. If folks remember several years ago, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which devastated the island. After that event, you had somebody by the name of Seth Klarman. Seth Klarman, if you go to Harvard, there's lots of buildings that say Klarman on them. Klarman is the CFO of the Baupost Group, which is a massive hedge fund. The Baupost Group held a huge amount of debt in Puerto Rico prior to Hurricane Maria. After Hurricane Maria, it went down to the island. Had a group of folks who went down and pressured the Puerto Rican government to sell off public schools, to sell off the public utility company, to privatize, in order that Puerto Rican government can serve its debt. Right. So we see this kind of this asset power all over the place, and the result of that was that students across the U.S. were raising objections to their endowments being invested in the Baupost Group, which many universities are. So this asset power, these large pools of finance have become objects of contestation. They become places where people are saying, we need more voice, we need more democracy, right? And that has in some ways led to ideas about rethinking what that democracy might look like. And this is now the positive part of the talk. So if you look around the U.S., there's and elsewhere as well, but I'm just going to focus on the U.S. If you look around the U.S., there's been a number of attempts at creating alternative financial institutions, alternative ways of thinking about how to allocate investment. Through things like public banks, through things like democratized pension funds, etc. My own involvement in this kind of story was to get involved in public bank in LA in 2021 and 2022. I worked with them in some different kind of efforts to lay out some plans for governance of a public bank, and then to get involved in Rashida Tlaib's basically her Public Banking Act, which she submitted to Congress in 2023. It's a revision of a Public Banking Act that she submitted in 2020. And basically this experience that I had, kind of this quasi-ethnographic experience of working with activist policymakers on sort of thinking about how to create democratic institutions, I came to identify some different principles that you can kind of see in the activism today about what are the things that make a democratic pool of finance actually democratic. In the book, I talk about 4 principles, but because this is a 30-minute talk, I'm only going to talk about 2. So just to kind of give you a sense of where this is going, I'm going to talk about 2 different kind of design principles for thinking about how we might actually create democratic pools of finance, and then I'll end the talk with a kind of schema of what it might look like to actually democratize finance in a kind of real way. So the first principle that you see over and over again when it comes to thinking about who has a say over how investment is allocated is the principle of affected interest. And what we see up on the screen are obviously smokestacks, but these are smokestacks that are in the city of Milwaukee, which is where I lived for a while. And these smokestacks up to the 90s were basically powered by coal. They were in the middle of, to the north of the energy company. There's the historic black neighborhood in Milwaukee, which is the poorest neighborhood in Milwaukee. To the south of these smokestacks is the historic Latino area, which is the second poorest area in Milwaukee. Those neighborhoods had higher rates of cancer. They had higher rates of asthma and other illnesses that are related to being so close to coal-producing smokestacks. And for many years, there were activist movements that were trying to pressure the city of Milwaukee and the energy company in particular to convert into a clean power energy company. And for many, many years, those demands were ignored because the people of Milwaukee even though they were affected by this thing that was in their neighborhood, they had no say over how it ran. They had no input. There was no seat on the board. There was no kind of questionnaire that went out and said, what should we be doing better? It was run as a private company that was providing a good to the city. That eventually, as it was converted into a clean energy company. But imagine had the people of Milwaukee had a greater say in how it run. The issue of the principle of effective interest is basically the idea that if an institution or organization has a meaningful, deep impact on your interests, as somebody who is affected by it, you should probably have some say over it. You should probably have some say, right? And that might be everything from a workplace to something else. And this as folks in the activism around finance are increasingly coming around to this idea for things like banks. The second principle that is kind of emerging from these debates. Does anybody know what this is on the screen by any chance? Do you know, Stephen? No. It's called a clariterion, and it goes back to ancient Greece, and it's basically a device. This one's obviously broken in half, but it's a device that's kind of like yay high. And you put a little marble in there, and this machine basically can do a random selection. It basically will randomly select certain numbers or whatever. This is by no means a defense of ancient Greece and all of its practices, but if you were to look at ancient Greece during the period of radical democracy, almost everything was governed by people that were randomly selected through this device. It wasn't just dirt juries. It was like the people that cleaned the temples after they had their rowdy rituals, the people that were maintaining the roads. There was a randomly selected group that was doing maintaining the prices. So if you wanted to hire a harpist for your party, you could make sure that they weren't gouging you. They basically kind of ran the gamut. And increasingly in the activism around finance, but I think democracy activism more generally, folks are coming around to the idea that randomly selected groups of people who can serve in assemblies are a really useful way to, one, deliberate, two, to make good judgments, but three, to ensure that everybody has access into being part of that. We typically have two ways of thinking about democratic participation: representative democracy or direct democracy, like what they did in Occupy Wall Street. Like big meetings, anybody can show up. I have tons of criticisms of both of those things, but I only have 30 minutes, so I'm not going to go into them. This idea of random selection folks are coming around to the idea that it could be a very useful way of bringing folks together where they can learn about an issue, understand it in a more deep way, and then make judgments on behalf of other people. And we see that this has increased dramatically. The use of randomly selected citizens' assemblies has increased dramatically since around Occupy Wall Street. So if you look at around the world, this is from the OECD. It's basically it's like a global picture. We've from places like Ireland, where they used citizens' assemblies to overturn constitutional bans on gay marriage and abortion, to France, where there were citizens' assemblies on end-of-life decisions, on the environment, in Colombia, where there's a citizens' assembly on basically urban development. Around the world, they've used these in different ways, designed them in different ways. But I can go much more into this in the Q&A. But there's been a lot of interesting research on this that suggests that they're actually a very useful way to get folks together to make democratic decisions. So those are the two principles I want to talk about. The book has four. Don't even try to figure out what's going on the screen. The book has four basic principles, but let's think about how we might use these in some way to democratize a pool of finance. So the red basically is this is the case of the bank. The red is basically what a normal bank is. Right? You have a board of banking experts. The board hires and manages the operational divisions. What if we built into that an assembly process for a public bank in which a group of randomly selected people from New York, for instance, came together over several weekends, discussed, deliberated what the mandates of that public bank should be. That is, where the portfolio should be emphasizing. Should the bank be putting 50% of its public investments into housing? Should it be putting 75% into something else? How should it be essentially allocating its investment? And let those mandates imbue the bank with a democratic purpose, right? Such that the values that ordinary people might have, which emerge from democratic deliberation and engagement, could actually inform how investment works. Now, in the book, it's I get much more complicated. There's lots of other little mini institutions that are attached onto it, do other different things. Don't worry about it. I only have 30 minutes. But the idea here is, in a kind of a minimalist version, we might begin to kind of create public banks that have this kind of democratic mandate. And if you look at places like Public Bank LA, this is precisely what they're doing. There's part of Public Bank LA's plan is to have a citizens assembly process to shape its mandates. If you look at Rashida Tlaib's bill, which he put forward in 2023, it includes stipulations that banks above a certain size need to include a citizens assembly process, randomly selected, that helps determine mandates. This is the minimalist version. In a maximalist version, and I'll just end here, you might think about how all the institutions of finance might be imbued in some ways with these kind of democratic processes. But I'm fresh out of time, so I can't really get into that. And I'll end it there.
I guess it's my turn. Well, first, congratulations, and thank you for your invitation. It's a pretty exciting book to read. And to speak about finance and democracy and being able to quote Borges, Henri Gauss, Stuart Hall is a feat that I really appreciated. So congratulations for that. I thought about why I had been asked to comment on your book, and I imagined that it was because I had a career in finance. I started my career as an economist at the investment bank, and I went on to work for George Soros, so probably the epitome of what finance is. And I imagined that I was supposed to play the role of the defender of finance versus the opponent to finance. And I realized, reading your book straight up in the introduction, that despite your critical views of finance, you wrote the book at the Jacobin Institute, which is an institute in LA, funded by Nicolas Berggruen, who is a private equity tycoon from Germany. You mentioned in some of your work the Jane Family Institute, which is funded by Bobby Jane, a star hedge fund manager in New York, and I've worked for Soros, so I thought it was a kind of an incongruous backdrop, but at the same time I think it says something about finance that I think you go into in the book, and it says something about how central it is to democracy and to our societies, for better and for worse. My framework for thinking about the interaction between democracy and finance, or democracy and the economy more broadly, has been really influenced by Danny Roderick, who is an economic development specialist who's worked in particular on industrial policy, and you talk a bit in the book about the interaction between industrial policy and finance. And I think he has a very neat framework for thinking about that, by basically saying that there is a fundamental triangle of incompatibility, what economists call trilemma, between state sovereignty, democracy, and he doesn't call it finance, but he calls it the open economy. And basically what he argues is that you cannot have all three things. You need to choose. The Europeans seem to have chosen the idea of sort of giving up state sovereignty to try and basically control markets or exert some control over finance and the open economy by way of a supranational organization. And the US, it seems, because it doesn't want to give away the power of the state, maybe giving up on democracy. And I think it's a pretty clean framework to think about these interactions and the trade-off. So to me, your book, and you described the first two-thirds of the book, or the first two-thirds of your presentation as being the boring part.
Depressing, not boring.
The depressing, and I actually found them to be the more exciting part, and the solutions part to be the ones that I was least convinced by. But I'll get to that in a moment. I think there is throughout the book something that is quite central, which you mentioned Schumpeter at the end, which really borrows from Schumpeter, which is this kind of intuition that capitalism carries within itself the poison that leads to its destruction. And that's an intuition that's been very central to actually a school of thought that you don't mention in the book, but which I have been very inspired by. And I know yesterday you had an event with Cédric Durand, who I view as kind of the heir of this École de la Régulation, the School of Regulation, which was a group of French economists in the 60s and 70s who really started from this Schumpeterian intuition that capitalism was doomed to fail, and tried to understand why it was not failing. And in particular, in thinking about the Fordist crisis, basically came up with the idea that somehow capitalism can be viewed as a pharmacon, so basically as the poison and the antidote, as basically carrying within itself the virus, but also producing the antibodies. And I think you touch on that intuition, and I think you have the sentence, which to me is one of the most important sentences of the book, where you say financial capitalism. Actually, maybe that's a question for later. You use finance capitalism and not financial capitalism. I tend to use both interchangeably. Maybe they're not exactly synonymous in your mind, but I'd love to ask you that later. But you say financial capitalism requires the continuous presence of the bailout state. And I think this is a very profound sentence, and one that I think needs to be unpacked. Indeed it does. Indeed it does, and I think it does for several quite fundamental reasons that are not touched upon in the book, and which, in my view, weaken your solution at the end. The reason why financial capitalism requires the continuous presence of the bailout state is because we have adopted for a while now what economists call fractional reserve banking, which is essentially the idea that we let banks create credit, we let banks create money. We give 1 unit of central bank money to the bank, and we allow that bank to expend that 1 unit of money to create more credit. That fundamental privatization of the creation of money is, in my view, both central to the way financial capitalism operates, but is also central to the way governments are required to basically backstop the banking system. And we've seen that during the global financial crisis, and we see that today. There's a second dimension of finance, which is not mentioned in the book, which I view as critical, which is particularly for the US and the dollar, which is the fact that the dollar is also the money of the world beyond being the money of the United States, and that creates a particular responsibility not only to backstop the US financial system, but as we've seen in the global financial crisis, to also backstop the global financial crisis. These two things create what I call the plasticity and the elasticity of money and credit, and require the presence of government alongside financial capitalism. And then there are people like Daniela Gabor who have mentioned, explore the idea of the Wall Street consensus, arguing that the role of the state alongside finance is not only to be just a bailout of the financial system, the provider of bailout of the financial system, but also to provide de-risking for the financial system to undertake certain activities. And so I'm saying that because I think it's important to understand that bailouts are not a bug or an anomaly of the system. They're actually central to the way the system operates and must operate, providing we want to preserve some of the feature of the financial system, and that's a question I have for you. There's something you have not mentioned in your presentation, so I feel I have to mention it now. I think you have a very powerful and convincing critique of crypto assets and cryptocurrencies, and of the idea, which is popular in some parts of this country, and in particular part of the country that you come from, that somehow decentralized finance can be a proxy for democratic finance. And I think you make a very convincing case as to why crypto assets are not a way of democratizing finance, and in fact they are maybe the worst symptom of a crisis of financial capitalism. And I think it's pretty rare to have such a detailed explanation as to how the project of the crypto bro is not a democratic project fundamentally, and I think that probably deserves more attention than it is given in your book, because I think it's a quite central argument. In my view, it's a particularly central argument given recent developments, which probably were not so clear when you wrote the book, which is basically the convergence of the Silicon Valley techno infrastructure and the crypto bros with the Wall Street apparatus. And that's a fairly recent development, which very recently, in fact, has now been sanctioned effectively by government action. I'm thinking of the Genius Act in particular, voted this summer. But I'm thinking also of an interesting financial development, which is the development of stablecoins, which is essentially linking the entire private crypto asset sphere both to the financial system, but also to the government by way of making US Treasury bills essentially the backer of these stable coins. And I think introducing into this private finance the renewed need for a bailout. So I think what has been created essentially by the expansion of stable coins and by the Genius Act is the intrusion of government and of the state as a provider of continuous bailout to the stable coin / crypto asset system, which is yet to develop and eventually to unravel that. So I think that's a very important element of your book that deserves more attention. And unlike me, you've had the patience to go deep into the details of the elucubration of people in the crypto world who want to believe that this can be, either want to believe or want to make believe. I'm not exactly sure. I think you'll tell us that this Ponzi scheme, and I think you describe it as such, is a democratic violation. And I thought this was a very convincing argument. Now, turning to what you present as the solution, and where I was less convinced, and given you have not spoken much about that, I will give you an opportunity to respond. You very rapidly dismiss both two aspects of democracy that I think deserve a bit more attention. One is the idea that representative democracy can fulfill and perform better than it has so far in governing finance. And you also dismiss rather quickly the idea that direct democracy can perform that role to propose that sort of participatory democracy via a lottery system could be a more effective way of addressing that. And on that, I think I'm yet to be convinced for several reasons. I would have liked to see a further exploration of models that you mentioned as kind of new experiments in the US, but that in fact have been quite present in the European financial landscape, and that in my view have not delivered the goods fully. We talked about public policy banks. It happens that this is a very important feature of European financial system. Pretty much every country in Europe has its own funding policy bank. Pretty much every country in Europe has its post bank. You mentioned that project being considered in the US as a real breakthrough, but this is something that we have actually a case for Europe, and where I'm not sure it has exactly delivered the goods that seem to be hoped for in the US. We have community banks. We have a very very important model in most European countries, which are cooperative banks, and which function not exactly as a lottery system, but which function with a sort of direct democracy that is very interesting, because they provide, for the first time in these cooperative banks, voting rights that are disconnected to your wealth. So basically, I think the big transition between the democratic world and the financial world is that the financial world is $1 one vote, the democratic world is one man, one vote. These cooperative banks, irrespective of how wealthy you are or how much deposit you have in the bank, you just have one vote. And so I think they are not exactly your model, because your model would involve on top of that a lottery system. But they're probably as close as it gets, in my mind, to a democratically run financial institution. And yet, I don't think they have delivered the goods fully, because I'm not sure that despite us in Europe having all of these types of non-fully financialized institution, I don't think we have escaped the travails that you have described brilliantly in your book on the corrosion of democracy by finance. And so why is that? And I think there are two important reasons. One is the role of government, which in your solution kind of disappears. While you have stated earlier that the government is kind of a central feature of the system. And so I think we have to think more thoroughly about what is the role of government in a system of democratized finance. And maybe this is me not being creative enough when it comes to thinking about participatory democracy, but I don't want to give up fully on the role that representative democracy can play in domesticating and controlling finance. And I think it's not because it hasn't been an outstanding success so far that we should throw the baby with the bath as water. And so I still view an important role for government that I don't see in your solution. And the second, it might be even more important, and is not mentioned at all in the book, it's the role of the cost of capital. Because you rightly mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that a number of these public goods, a number of the investments are not taking place because finance considers them unproductive, or does not consider that they have a sufficiently high return on capital. But that is not going to change even when these institutions are democratically governed, because eventually there is such a thing as the constraint of the cost of capital. And so to me, that is kind of a fundamental sort of Achilles heel in how we think about democratizing finance, which is who do we set the risk-free rate or the cost of capital for the economy? Today we have decided, for a number of reasons which we can debate and argue over, that independent central banks should set the cost of capital, and that they set the cost of capital against a mandate, which in most countries is a single mandate, and the US happens to be a dual mandate, which is to basically minimize inflation. Because we deem that inflation is a long-term cost to the economy, is a long-term cost to investment. I'm saying all of that because if we don't have a cost of capital set for the economy that is sufficiently low, we will still be unable to invest in the green transition, in socially empowering economic activities. And so we may have well democratized our institutions if we still have a cost of capital that is set by an independent central bank at a cost that is prohibitive. These democratic institutions are still not going to be able to finance the sort of green investments and the sort of public goods that we call for. And so I think we have here a fundamental difficulty, which I don't know if it can only be resolved by a democratic object or solution. And by that I mean, you could argue, let's throw away the independent central bankers and let's finally have, central banks governed by either politicians or another way. I mean, in some ways this is the Trump project, like Powell is setting rates that are too high for the economy. I want to put my men at the Federal Reserve so we can set the interest rate at the level that we want. There are reasons why, we have thought historically that it's not a great idea. And so I'm wondering how we go around that fundamental problem, a problem which I think is kind of philosophical in nature, because by setting the cost of capital, we also set the price of the future. This is fundamentally what central bankers do when they decide about the risk-free rate. They decide about the price of the future. And I think that, to me, is something I would love to hear you on, because this is something I'm myself proud of. And finally, to conclude, your book reads like a very Marxist critique of capitalism and of finance, and yet you don't seem to imagine a world without capitalism. And so I find that tension throughout the book fascinating, which is you have a very Marxist view of how the economy works, but you don't reach a Marxist conclusion that therefore we need to bring down capitalism. And I would love to tease you on that, because I find that quite original. To some extent, you're very skeptical of financial capitalism, but you still hope that it can be reformed. And I was struck that I looked like how many times you refer to revolution, and you refer to it almost not once in the entire book, as though all of these transformations that are very profound that you describe can happen through let's call them social democratic reforms rather than through radical political and sort of revolutionary transformations. And I wanted to tease you on that tension. But thank you. I think it's a formidable read, and I certainly encourage you to read.
I'll read like 5 minutes to respond, and then we can.
Okay. That was amazing, and I don't know if you typed it up, but maybe just like scan that and send it my way. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts, but I also have 5 minutes, so I'm gonna try to just get a big this. So the one thing I would say is on the question of representative democracy and kind of why I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think for those of us, broadly in the progressive camp, we've kind of used these concepts of public and private to really, in some ways, shape what we think of as good and bad. I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but I'm saying there's this idea that the private is the market, the private is capitalism, the private is the neoliberalism, it's the result of it's the driver of all the things that have gone wrong. The public is the state. The public's good. The public is the thing that can make things better. The public can make us whole. It can right the wrongs of the private. And I think that just that discursive framing is in many ways a cultural residue of the Cold War, and that we think in these kind of public versus private terms is it's the result of us being kind of like bashed down generation after generation of pitting the Soviet system versus the U.S. system or something like that. And I think the much more fundamental issue, which is why I'm hostile to representative democracy, is a third category, which is the demos, which is ordinary people, which is ordinary working class people who are disempowered from both public and private institutions. They are disempowered from both the state and the market. And so the reason why I lean so heavily into the critique of representative democracy is because those of us on the progressive side of the camp have been telling ourselves that the solution is more state, that the solution is more representative democracy doing more good things. But I think core to my critique is that representative democracy is already, in some fundamental way, not democratic. The things that it produces are a result of the fact that it's already controlled in just the same way as private institutions are controlled by elite interest. So that's the kind of core of my critique of representative democracy. I wouldn't say I would, I'm hostile to any kind of representative. I'm not crazy. But I would just say that to the extent that we want to try to generate solutions, try to generate alternatives, we need to find ways of empowering the demos, who are, in my view, completely disempowered when it comes to both public and private institutions. All right, maybe just really quickly on the, because I've already probably talked 5 minutes, but on the question of Marxist analysis, but not Marxist solutions. That's interesting. I never really thought about it like that. I guess I would say that like the way I'm thinking about it is alternatives to capitalism are generated in a kind of, capitalism is more like an ecology. Eric Owen Wright, a sociologist, used to talk about this, where he would say, capitalism is like a lake. There's different types of species. You've got the capitalist species, but then over there, there's a library, and that's kind of a little bit of a socialist species. And capitalism is all about alternatives to capitalism is in some ways all about kind of crowding out the bad actors with good actors through the creation of new institutions. And that's what I think. That's what I'm proposing. I'm proposing the kind of the institutions that can be driven by essentially democratic mandates, that can crowd out in some ways the investment decisions that are solely driven by profit. And I think there's actually a bit of a transition theory in the book as well. So the creation of a public bank, leaving the very important points you said about the cost of capital aside, the creation of a public bank, even though private banks will be opposed to it, it's not really a direct threat to what private banks do. If the purpose of the public bank is to funnel investment into areas that are systematically underfunded because it's not profitable to anybody, it's not really like you're entering into direct competition with it. Post banks sometimes do, through retail, things like that, but like a public investment bank that's aimed at sort of filling in the gaps in the market that are being underinvested in, I don't think it really creates that direct threat. But with the creation of more and more of these public banks, if we were to ever get to the point where we would be thinking about converting, say, a large private investment bank into something that has democratic mandates, you'd almost certainly get a massive blowback from capital, right? And why I'm saying this is because referencing the kind of ecology way of thinking about it, like capitalism as a lake, with more and more public banks that are supplemental to the existing financial system, you now have investment power that can respond to disinvestment in the case of a broader, revolutionary showdown, if you want to put it in those terms, which in some ways I think is kind of not the best way to put it. So I do have in some ways a kind of bigger alternative and maybe something of a transition idea for how to get there. But you're right. I think it's impossible to have it do it in one big bill. I'll stop there because I've already talked for 5 minutes.
Thank you both. Questions? And we'll take 2 at a time. So start.
Yeah. I wanted to thank you both for this great conversation. I actually feel like both of your perspectives, very different, are getting at sort of some of the totality of why science keeps us so preoccupied. I was wondering, Professor McCarthy, if you could say more about, I guess like, when I think of finance, like sort of like the first word I think of is like time, the second word risk, like, you know, sort of post-Keynesian, Harry Merlin sort of school of like, you know, finance is ultimately about sort of controlling the present with an eye to the future. That, you know, there's obvious positive forms of that, you know, like building this lovely monorail in the photograph. And there's also negative forms, like we've all lived through, you know, 2008 financial crisis and seen how, you know, risk can affect like your ability to like put food on the table. I guess I'm wondering sort of what role do you see sort of the role of time, risk, in sort of like your vision of democratizing finance?
Take one more question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a bit skeptical that the demos would have the ability to make the investments wisely. I mean, people know about their lives, but if you look at their ability to invest in the stock market or in anything else, they don't really show a lot of wisdom. And then what you refer to as a public bank seems to me it's kind of a loser bank, and it won't be as profitable as other banks. So why would it exist? Rather, investing in the common good. Why isn't that a function of government, not a private entity?
Yeah, those are both interesting points. Maybe starting in a second, kind of working my way back. And by the way, you should also jump in. On the issue of the wisdom of like essentially the non-expert, there's been quite a bit of new research on these deliberative assemblies, and that is a key question that folks ask. How can non-experts make decisions about these complicated things? I should say, as in representative democracy, we're supposed to do that all the time, right? We're electing people that have a whole range of different policy positions.
You know who the president is, right?
Right. But we're a whole range of. I'm saying we don't do it very well.
Right.
Like we're supposed to elect people based on a wide range of policy positions that are all quite complicated. What this mechanism of selection, like you're selecting a participant, does is it actually gives folks the time to learn about an issue and to deliberate about an issue in order to, one, make an informed decision, but also to discover their preferences about something. This is a mistake I think, for people who constantly look at polls as if this is like a direct reflection of what people think. The deliberative process is actually something that allows people to discover what their preference might be, which is precisely why in Ireland, the poll was different before and after the deliberative process on the issue of abortion and gay marriage. So one, the deliberative process allows you to do that. Two, there's some interesting research in cognitive psychology that actually says that, or it finds, that when you bring people together that are cognitively and demographically diverse, and you have them deliberate and try to solve a problem, they're actually much better than solving a problem than if you have a group of people that are demographically and cognitively very similar, but maybe just like all elite and very smart. Put another way, it might be, in fact, you might produce better outcomes if you're having mandates set by a group of randomly selected people. You might have better outcomes with that group of randomly selected people than you would have if it was a group of Harvard economists deciding where the public bank should spend its money. Which to me is this is why I actually fundamentally believe in democracy. That in ways like these processes allow people to kind of come to an issue from different perspectives and then to generate a judgment that reflects all those different perspectives. And the second thing that it does is it actually allows for cognitive divisions of labor. As somebody who's not selected to be on the public bank, I wouldn't have any idea what the best thing to be for the bank should be. You'd be kind of giving that decision-making power to somebody else for a period, right? It's the idea that Aristotle said democracy is governing and being governed in turn. That's kind of what it is. There's a number of these different assemblies that have their own kind of objective that are trying to figure out a solution for it. So yeah, that's how I would kind of think about it like that. I think the expertise kind of critique is in some ways overblown. And the bigger issue for me is that we have these huge areas of deep and profound underinvestment that the experts aren't solving, which which is why I'm kind of hopeful we'll just give it a try. Yeah, and the time.
Yeah, like, what's the role of like sort of risk and time in your version of finance? Like, if like finance is ultimately about like we have to do or not do things today in order for like something years from now to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk issue, it kind of gets to the cost of capital issue as well. This is going to seem like a punt, but I swear it's not. It's entirely a political issue to me. It's about like how you capitalize these funds and what the expected rate of return is. This is a huge debate that's happening right now in places like Public Bank LA, but also in San Francisco, where they're trying to. But if folks don't know, there was a bill that was passed in California several years ago that established a framework for creating municipal banks under Newsom. And now all these cities are trying to do it, and they're actually kind of getting quite far. But one of the key issues is like, how do you capitalize the bank, and what is the expected rate of return? And that is entirely determined by the public sources of funding for the bank, and whether those are regular or whether they get an initial big capitalization and then they have to reproduce it through profit. And that, to me, it's a political question. It's really a political question. If it's an underfunded bank, it's going to perform exactly like a private bank would perform because it needs to survive. If it's a bank that there was a moment, basically, when Carter ran against Reagan and lost in 1979, he had this thing called the reindustrialization plan. Never happened. But the idea was basically the state was going to guarantee certain rates of return for pension funds that allocated investments into states and cities that were undergoing deindustrialization. And essentially to sort of say, look, if you invest in this, you will make at least X amount, even if like the return is lower, the state is going to guarantee it. I think things like that will are something that can essentially lower the risk of a socially good investment, which wouldn't otherwise be seen as profitable. That's how we're thinking about it.
And if I may push on that and link to the cost of capital, either, because you're right that depending on the model of the bank, its internal cost of capital changes. So if it's given a large equity injection by a municipal or public authority, it changes if it's not. But ultimately, this institution, irrespective of how large or small its capital injection is in the first place, has to have a positive return on capital. Or eventually, it will go bankrupt and require a new capital injection. And we could say, it's fine, maybe it will require a new capital injection. But then I think that leads to your question, which is, if that is the case, what is the point of the bank in the first place? Why don't we let the municipal organization, the city or the state, just make the investment in the first place? And states are actually designed, public institutions are actually designed to make institutions that are not profitable on a private basis, but provide social, ecological, and other returns. And so, this is why, to me, this question of cost of capital is potentially central. If we are going to do investments that are not going to return a profit, then I think they should be investment that should be made by a public authority that is designed to internalize the sociological and other externalities. But this is maybe a view that is too dogmatic in the separation between public and private.
That's a question.
Mike, I was going to ask why regular people would want to spend two weekends a month sitting around deliberating over mandates for a public bank and learning all the issues related to that. That seems like a big ask for me. And I think, historically, the left strategy for democratizing finance came out of, having strong trade unions, labor organizations that produced their own financial expertise, their own financial experts, their own priorities, push for democratization of the state, push for changes in, central bank policy and, and in macroeconomic policy in general, rather than relying on the kind of, this sort of very specific institutional structure around a sort of public institution. Isn't that a more viable and also kind of bigger vision for how we democratize finance, that we push the state at the big level through rebuilding popular organizations, bring people together?
I wondered if you could talk a little more concretely about what happened with the Public Bank LA that you were involved with. Who actually ends up serving on its deliberative bodies? Is it self-selected toward people who are more middle-class, professional or middle-class, men more than women, because women have most of still, the responsibility for child care, et cetera, et cetera. How has it invested, and have those investments really reflected the needs of the community or
Yeah, these are both good. Just Jonah's question. The etymological origins of the word idiot go back to ancient Greece. The word was idiote. And it was a word specifically for people who refused to do jury service. It was specifically used for people who were like, got the lottery and were like, I don't want to do it. It wasn't compulsory to do it, but there was shaming involved. And it was also kind of a culture. It was such a cultural expectation that you would do it, that there was a word specifically for it that we now have in our vocabulary. So this is just to say that I think part of what I'm advocating for is actually a change of around the culture of democratic participation, and I'm all for the idea that people should feel an obligation to do it, right? Maybe not quite at the point where I feel like the state should force you to do it, but I will toy with it if you want to talk about that. I would absolutely not trying to say that this is something that is in place at rebuilding labor unions or something. There's no, I'm not saying this is one thing versus something else. And in fact, I suggested what I said earlier about a political problem. None of this is all just pie in the sky, like stuff, until we have like broad-based social movement organizations that are pressuring the state to do this. I don't think any politician is aside from a couple that are not in power in big ways, gonna do this. It requires that kind of active mobilization from community organizations, labor. And that's actually goes to the Public Bank LA thing. It's actually there is no Public Bank LA. Like it's not a complete bank. Right now it's just a movement. It's something but it is working its way through basically the city council process. They're doing. It's well on its way to being formed. But at this point, it's a coalition of folks that are working with several city council members to use this bill that was passed by Newsom, AB 627 or something, to establish one. And kind of speaking to Jonah's point, it is a coalition of labor. So SEIU is one of the organizations. It's a coalition of racial justice community activism group, as well as the third member is a community financial institution organization. So Public Bank LA would not be possible without the mobilization that you're pointing to. It wouldn't exist. And in all the different cities where you have the emergence of these, it's a result of mobilization. New York has one. There was a similar bill that was put forward to the one that Newsom did. It was put forward in 2022. It was put forward earlier this year, basically to create a framework for the development of municipal banks in New York. It has not been passed like it was in California. But if that was passed, there's a People's Bank in New York that has that's a large coalition of folks that could use that opening to sort of help push it into the city council. You couldn't create a public bank in New York without that being passed, essentially. So yeah, it hasn't been created, but they're in the process.
Time for maybe two more questions. Or maybe let's combine all three. So first in front, there.
I really like what you had to say about deliberative democracy and the case for it. And it's quite remarkable that there's been this proliferation of examples of it. You mentioned the Irish case, which is in a way the most striking. But I just wonder to what extent, I mean, they all exist within a wider context where it's not like that at all. And there's also a problem, I mean, in the Irish case, for example, it was all to do with people's interests and they learned over time. It was extraordinary how over time results arrived that nobody really could imagine before. But I'm wondering to what extent it's kind of, I mean, we talk about the use of this, what we call autocracy, this mechanism. You talk about this as something supplemental. And I suppose my question is to what extent is that, I mean, must it not remain supplemental and marginalized? Or at any rate, I mean, isn't the problem also about scalability, the extent to which you can actually scale such decision making through autocracy upwards to a larger scale?
I think we had a question in the middle.
Just really quickly, I was wondering what in particular you have in mind when you mean direct democracy in the financial context and
And then right
Yeah. About halfway through, you mentioned institutions like the Jane Family Institute, and evidently the institute that sort of underwrote the development of this book, the Soros Institute, these sort of like progressive research institutions that come out of hedge fund wealth or private equity wealth. In my impression, these efforts are always sort of constrained by not undermining their sources of wealth. Do you think they can ever break out of that and sort of advocate for like real systemic change in economic systems, even though that would go against their interests?
Go for it.
recent questions.
I don't know. I think in many ways we're sitting in a hedge fund right now. But you kind of, you know, we're in contradictory institutions that are on the one hand driven by things that we find pernicious, but on the other hand give us a space where we can make a living and have conversations like this.
I also work for a hedge fund, so.
What's that?
I work for a hedge fund, so I understand.
Yeah, you get it. I mean, I think in the same way, like American labor unions in the 1930s didn't say, work, let's just do something else. They try to kind of change their institutions and transform them and imbue them with, you know, frankly democratic principles. And so these institutions have their own interests and they're driven by their own logics. But you know, much like a university, we use them as spaces to advance new ideas and also challenge those logics. You know, it's complicated. But there's I guess on the democracy, direct democracy scalability thing, I think those are actually related questions. The direct democracy story is, I guess it's most identified with Porto Alegre and the budgeting experiments there, which were established under the Workers' Party. And those experiments have been basically very large open meetings where anybody can come and contribute, but they're local, like it's for local budgets. that kind of model works in some contexts. I think it's limited personally because of one, there's self-selection bias. So in the case of direct democracy, the people that show up want to show up. I'm deeply skeptical of people who want to go to meetings. I want the people that are there to kind of not want to be there, right? Like the people that show up, like maybe they have like interest in the outcome, or they kind of are, they just really they feel like this is a source of power for them. So one, there's like the self-selection bias that I think is a problem in direct democracy. Two is that it's actually not scalable. Like there's a kind of there's a limit to which you can have direct democracy forms of decision making, right? Anything beyond a neighborhood, you're getting into something where, what, are we going to fill a whole NFL stadium full of people and have a deliberation? Like you just simply can't do it. And what random selection does is it basically allows you to do a random selection at any scale. It could be a city, it could be a state, it could be a country, it could be a region, it could be a tribal a unit, it could be the globe. You can use methods to basically select from any scale. So to me it's just from like a technical point of view, it's kind of endlessly scalable. From like a political, maybe this is what you're getting at, Stephen. From like a kind of like, could this even work point of view, I think we need to think about the principle of subsidiarity. The idea that from the EU you might have some critiques of subsidiarity, but the idea that you create institutions at scales that fit the kinds of problems that they're solving, right? That if you're trying to solve the issue of industrial development in the U.S., maybe you need an American industrial bank. If you're trying to solve the issue of housing in New York, maybe you need a bank focused on housing in New York, or you need a public bank. So that's how I think about scalability, is through like developing institutions that fit, that are trying to solve some problem, and that fit that problem in terms of the scale of their